storage and transportation and access to classified information, which are all true. Those are all real rules. And what they neglect to tell the court is that none of those rules apply to the president.
Right. You're bearing the lead there, yeah.
And it was a fairly low-level classification, but Trump did have one document at Mar-a-Lago. Biden had two FRD documents. He had twice as much as Trump. Biden had 50 years worth of stuff in his house that he'd been hoarding and stealing, and he knew he had it. Whereas with Trump, those boxes got packed up by staffers at the end of his presidency. There was chaos. And it all went to Mar-a-Lago. It was actually this incident that led me to write the book. And when the home of a former president was raided by the FBI, that got my attention. And also because it was a mishandling case, and I probably have more experience with those cases than just about anyone in the world, I focused in on it and I started researching. And what I found is that with every stone I turned over, I found more malfeasance on behalf of the Biden administration. I was particularly interested, of course, to see the FBI affidavit supporting the raid warrant. That's the most important document. And so what the Biden administration was doing was they were releasing meaningless documents, things that really didn't matter, claiming transparency while they were fighting tooth and nail to keep that raid warrant off the public record. So they weren't seeking transparency at all, even though that's what they were saying. And as is often the case with that administration, what they're doing is exactly the opposite of what they're saying they're doing, or they're doing what they're accusing someone of doing, right?
Projection,
and so I was anxious to read the affidavit, and finally it was released on the public record with heavy redactions. But the part I was interested in was not redacted. And that's the part where they were explaining classified information to the federal court and generally and how it all works. And then also specifically the classified information that was believed to be at issue in this case. I have written hundreds of those types of affidavits to federal judges, and I have supervised the drafting of thousands of such affidavits. They didn't even properly articulate the standard under the executive order for classifying information. And I think that was actually an honest mistake because there was nothing to be gained from it. They were just paraphrasing the standard, and by doing so, it was inaccurate. Other things they did was, very briefly, I think there's one sentence in that affidavit where they say that classified information is classified pursuant to executive order, which is true. Then they glance right over that. They make it sound like that's just a mere ministerial point.
Right.
And then they go on to list all these rules about, storage and transportation and access to classified information, which are all true. Those are all real rules. And what they neglect to tell the court is that none of those rules apply to the president.
Right. You're bearing the lead there. Yeah.
Yeah. None of them. You wouldn't know that to read the affidavit. Let me tell you, they made it sound like all of those things apply to the president and none of them apply to the president. At the beginning of the book, I do what I hope is explaining classified information and the whole paradigm around it in a way that anyone can understand. At least that was my goal, because information is classified pursuant to presidential power. Congress does not own classified information. The judiciary does not own classified information. It belongs to the executive branch and specifically to the president. Now, people wouldn't want to hear this, but Joe Biden could take a box of classified documents, top secret, bring them home to Delaware for the weekend, sunbathers on Rehoboth Beach. He will have broken no law. That stuff belongs to him. He can do that. You don't like that. I don't like that, but that's the law. It was so misleading of the FBI to make it sound like the president had violated these rules, because all these rules, transportation, storage, access, they apply to everyone below the president. Everyone below the president. But the president is not bound by his own orders. To declassify classified information, as you would expect, there's a process, and the process has to be followed. But not for the president. The president could declassify information by waving a wand over a box and saying, "Spectro declassiarmis," right? That's all it takes. He could literally quaff 3 martinis, pluck out the straw, and scribble it on a cocktail napkin if he wants. It doesn't matter because he's the president.
Right.
And the president, so this is all done under executive power, and the president personifies executive power in pure form. You would never know any of this reading the FBI affidavit. Another thing that jumped out at me in reading the affidavit, and I had a little bit of experience with the Presidential Records Act, but very little, but I knew that it was a civil statute with no criminal provisions. And yet that was one of the primary justifications supporting the probable cause, that the president had violated a civil statute, and that somehow justified, taking a battering ram to his home. It's ridiculous because not only is it a civil statute, but it's a civil statute that has no enforcement mechanism against against a president or vice president, current or former. And under that statute, the president gets to decide and a vice president gets to decide what are personal records and what are going to be presidential records that get sent to the National Archives. And so these are just a couple of the things in the FBI affidavit that jumped out at me, but it made me very suspicious and I just kept digging.
Now, do you think that the FBI should have had the competency to write a proper affidavit that would have been more in alignment with the standards that you would expect? Or is this something that the FBI is not familiar with and they can just chalk up to incompetency? Or is there more in that creation of that affidavit that was, nefarious, that hinted that maybe this was nefarious, like they're trying to hide the ball in order to go justify the raid?
It's a little bit of both. They do have the expertise. They do not work with classified information as much as the intelligence community. So
yeah, because you're CIA, you're like the expert CIA guy. These are just FBI guys. So maybe they chalk it up. We're confused.
Well, while that's true, the FBI, they have national security people in a national security section, and they have counterintelligence agents. I've worked with many of them. And, at the agent level, they're fantastic. I don't have gripes with individual agents. It's the higher levels, right? That's where all the nefarious activity occurs. But so they have the expertise, not as much as the intelligence community, but they have enough. And so there were some things in there, like when they misstated the standard for classification. That was, I think, an honest mistake. But the other things, it was very clear to me that they were describing things in a manner that would persuade the judge to grant them what they wanted, which was a raid warrant, and that they were making no attempt at all to be honest. No attempt to honestly describe the situation with classified information and who the executive order applies to and who it doesn't apply to. And, in most cases, it wouldn't matter. Any other case that is not involving a president,
right?
It doesn't matter.
Right.
But when you're going after a president, it matters very much. And I happen to know some of the people who work in these areas. They're still there. And I know they know better. And so what this was is something that I'm sure you've seen throughout your career, where the prosecution is putting its thumb on the scale right from the get-go.
Yeah. And that was a question that I have, is how do these mechanics get through? So is the judge, I think it was a magistrate judge who probably doesn't have a lot of experience in the classified document space, so maybe he's not looking for that? Or is that a misread? Do you remember who this judge was and how that?
You're absolutely right. It was a magistrate. He probably had very little, if any, exposure previously to classified information.
Yeah.
And he took the government's word at its word. And so I would not fault him, but it also wouldn't have taken much research to figure out what I'm telling you, that when you're going after a president, you have to have a different approach than you would to everyone else, because a president has unique authority over classified information, and you have to acknowledge that. So I don't think I'd be too hard on the magistrate. And in fact, I did not criticize him in my book, even though this particular magistrate had donated to Hillary Clinton's campaign, and in fact, even recused himself from a case because it involved Hillary Clinton. And so he certainly had political bias, but I didn't feel there was enough there to criticize him, and I did not in my book.
Let's pick it up where we left off. So this raid happens, this siege happens, you start looking into it, and it triggers in you decision to write this book. Kind of pick us up from there.
Sure. So I started researching and writing, and like I said, I was very disturbed at what I was finding. And I thought, maybe I'll write an article. Maybe people would really want to know the truth about this, because I was also seeing everything on television. And 95% of the mainstream media is controlled by the Democratic Party, in my opinion. In fact, I ended up doing almost a whole chapter on propaganda, right? And propaganda on the raid, because I could not believe what I was seeing, which was, this wasn't a raid at all. It was like a public service visit. And, there was no force involved. This is all just normal stuff. This stuff happens all the time.
Yeah, I actually underlined it, so I loved it. You said it was a propaganda cluster bomb. This one, NBC reporter Ryan Riley, everybody knows who he is. As soon as the raid happens, it's statement after statement after statement. He says, the FBI is a conservative-leaning law enforcement organization, and we have sort of lost the thread on that in the last 6 years. MSNBC legal analyst and former, and I love how you did this, how you told us about these MSNBC like he's a legal analyst, but where did he come from? Oh, yeah, he came from the DOJ, right? He came from the Eastern District of Virginia, and so he's going to be supporting whatever the government is doing. And so it's all legal. He says it's all lawful. It's not a raid. They are not there improperly or unlawfully. And the list goes on and on. You got Mara Gray, you got Neil Katyal over from MSNBC, says, they're returning to their historical position as a law enforcement agency above politics, trying to do the right thing, right? And the list goes on and on. You got 3 pages of it. And so as a ex-CIA lawyer and somebody who studies propaganda, knows this stuff, what was going on here? here?
So, the CIA does basically two things. It steals secrets and it engages in presidentially authorized covert action. Covert action stuff, that's the stuff in the movies, right? That's the real dangerous stuff. And it's technically defined as when the United States government is attempting to influence political, economic, and military conditions abroad while hiding the hand of the US government, right? And so that's not just collecting intelligence, that's trying to influence what's happening in foreign countries around the world. Now, this is very controversial stuff. Part of covert action is covert influence, what most people would call propaganda. And so I taught these things at the CIA. I had studied covert actions that were declassified and worked on FOIA cases where I had the redacting pen in my hand because not everything gets released. And so when I look at the media today, I look at it through that lens because I know how these things work. I know how propaganda works. And some of them are obvious and some of them are subtle, but that's how I look at the media. And that's why I did that one deep dive on the raid, because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And it was a great example that I think anyone could understand of how propaganda works. And, I'll give the Democratic Party credit for this.
Yeah.
They stay on message, right? They get those talking points out. They stay on message, right? You look at across the stream of mainstream media and they're regurgitating pretty much the same bullet points. And there's something to be said for that. Again, I don't share the politics, but I would at least give them credit for being organized and staying on message.
They're very good at that. And one of the things that we saw after the raid was this narrative that these were nuclear secrets and these were national security travesties. We were all going to die, and whatever was, the worst thing they could possibly muster and write about, they said were in those documents. And so can you maybe give us some clarity on what your interpretation was of what's actually in there, if you know, or the level of severity? Give us some context for those claims.
One of the criticisms of the FBI and DOJ that has come out in the DOJ IG reports is that they have media leak strategies, right? Part of the way they litigate a case, prosecute a criminal case, is to make selective leaks to the media to influence the case. And the DOJ IG was very critical of this conduct. And so that's what we saw in the Mar-a-Lago case. And the great example is the one you just gave, the nuclear secrets at risk.
Yeah.
Trump could be doing anything. He could be selling the nuclear codes. Now, all of this is ridiculous because the nuclear codes are probably changed, every couple seconds. But put that aside. So one of the first things I did when looking at the FBI raid affidavit, I looked to the section where they describe the classified information that they believe is at issue. And there's all kinds of code words that don't mean anything to most people, but they're very meaningful to me. And you know what's not in there? The code word for nuclear information. There's also no mention of the Atomic Energy Act, which is a whole separate thing that covers nuclear information. Not mentioned in there at all, which means they were leaking that to the media while they knew darn well that none of that was at issue in the case. Now, even more interesting, there was one document that Trump had that was labeled FRD. FRD means formally restricted data, which means it's classified and it relates to nuclear information, but it's classified under the executive order. And it was a fairly low-level classification, but Trump did have one document at Mar-a-Lago. Biden had two FRD documents. He had twice as much as Trump. You never heard anyone in the media clutching their pearls over nuclear information in Biden's case. There's twice as much in his case as there was in Trump's. It was low-level stuff because if it was higher level, it would have had different classification determinations, which were not there.
When we're comparing and contrasting this, you brought up Biden and his documents. He was treated completely differently for violations that were worse, and you go through some analysis of that in your book. And I guess, can you give us some thoughts on maybe why that discrepancy occurred, right? Why was Biden treated so differently for his documents? Is it about obstruction, or is it about Trump being, difficult to work with? Or why was Trump raided and Biden got a couple taps on the shoulders and his lawyers got to rummage around and search things and not get raided?
Sure. Let me first just briefly set the stage, right, for the conduct that was at issue. Biden in his home had over 100 classified documents. He also had some in his downtown DC office. This is private home in Wilmington, Delaware. They were all over the house. The first level den, the third level den, the basement, the foyer, in a grocery bag outside his bedroom, in filing cabinets, in folders, right? So some of them were in boxes. And it's possible if documents are in boxes that maybe he didn't know, right? Maybe they were packed by staffers and he'd never looked in them. But in Biden's house, those documents had been placed in file folders, some of which were in Biden's own handwriting. Now, these documents that he had, they went back to the 1970s. He was literally hoarding and stealing classified documents for 50 years, half a century, right? And of course, people wouldn't know this because this wasn't, being given to them by the mainstream media. Half a century of stealing classified documents and bringing them to his home and putting them in file folders, all over the house. And
And he
so,
wasn't president during those times, so he doesn't
oh
have
yeah,
that
that's
same
right.
power that Trump has.
Exactly. And it gets a little complicated. For instance, there's one area of the executive order where vice presidents are excused and don't have to follow all the rules of everyone else. And that's for
That's right.
access. And that makes sense, right? Because these are the president and the vice president are the two highest level, elected people in the executive branch. And so why would you make the vice president take a polygraph test, go through a background investigation, have people looking through his credit card purchases, right?
Right.
Visiting with a psychologist, all the stuff that I had to do, right, to maintain a security clearance. So to get access to classified information, the vice president is excused from those things, but the vice president is not excused from handling, storage, sharing, all those other rules. And at this time, right up to the point that Biden was taking this stuff, which was, from the time he was a senator up to 2016, when he left the vice presidency, he had to abide by those rules, but he was violating them knowingly, right? That's a violation of the espionage statute. He was knowingly violating that portion that is for knowing retention, right? Willful retention in the language of the statute. And then also, he was absolutely grossly negligent in the handling of classified information throughout his vice presidency. So that's kind of the conduct that's at issue, right? And you compare that with Trump. Biden had 50 years worth of stuff in his house that he'd been hoarding and stealing, and he knew he had it. Whereas with Trump, those boxes got packed up by staffers at the end of his presidency. There was chaos, and it all went to Mar-a-Lago. And it was there about a year and a half, right? In a home that was guarded by the Secret Service, where Biden's home did not have that level of security for many years. And there was no evidence, it's not even mentioned in the indictment, nothing to indicate that Trump knew what was in the boxes. And the special counsel, ahead of myself a little bit, he got around all that by coming up with a unique form of causation because Trump caused it all to happen, he said. Trump caused the boxes to be packed. It's kind of hilarious, right? It's like these were the last days of the presidency and it was obviously chaotic. But according to the special counsel, Trump, was dictating to everyone what to put in boxes, knowing every pedigree of every document while planning a coup d'etat. Quite the multitasker, old Donald J., huh? So the conduct is so different. Trump violated no law whatsoever. There's also evidence right in the indictment that Trump considered everything that was going to his house to be his personal papers, right? They actually quote the people working for him, Walt Nutta, and I forgot the name of the other guy. He said these are his papers, which would have shielded him completely. And so the conduct is completely different. And yet, look at how the investigations were handled. And there's only one way to explain the stark disparities in how these investigations were handled, and that is political bias. I mean, you have the Biden DOJ investigating President Biden. They actually permitted Biden's private attorneys to search Biden's homes. And this is after classified had even been found in the home. This is after classified with information and documents were found in the garage. The FBI didn't search the house. They let Biden's private lawyers. Now, when have you ever heard of that? There's only one case I'm aware of, and that was Hillary Clinton's case, where the FBI let Clinton's lawyers search her hard drives, and they never even got copies of them. So there's just no other way to explain that than political bias.
Right. They went into Melania's closet, is my understanding. They were taking photographs of Barron's bedroom, and then they were leaking the photographs out, right? We saw the photographs that came out, and we saw all the horrendous cover sheets on there. And I don't know if you're, in your experience, if that's something that's normal for them to do, to publicize the crime scene and the classified documents, or if that's
no, it's not.
Standard.
And I give this as yet another example of the propaganda because they want to taint the voting pool and they want to taint the jury pool. And so what they did with the documents was they brought the cover sheets, these glossy red, top secret.
Right.
I call it's like the national security version of a Victoria's Secret fashion show, right? So they put that on there and then they photographed them and then they put the photographs on the public record.
Yeah.
A judge could call that tampering with evidence, but
look doctored,
And in addition to that, we see all these photos of all these boxes and boxes and boxes of documents. You would think that Trump didn't have the right to take stuff from his presidency. Presidents get to take stuff. They get to take a lot of stuff. It's not unusual that he had boxes in his home from his presidency. Not only that, there were only about 100 some odd documents that the FBI seized in the raid. They could have all fit in one box. So why is the FBI and DOJ showing us photographs of 40 boxes and boxes piled up around toilets? I'll tell you why, because a picture's worth 1,000 words. words. And they want that at the forefront of people's minds. They're poisoning the voting pool. That's why they did it. Now, in contrast, one of the places they found classified documents belonging to Biden were in the boxes that Biden has donated to the University of Delaware. And he's donated over 2,000 boxes of documents from his time as a senator and as vice president. Now, they didn't even search them all. They sampled them. Around 260 boxes or something they sampled. And they found classified documents in there, right? But you know what you haven't seen? You haven't seen any photos of Biden's 2,000 boxes, have you? No, you have not. And you know what? You're not gonna.